So, Allan, which main lessons or insights gained in those early days you consider still being relevant today? You did mention the importance of the link between risk reduction and development, but there's probably others that you think are as a hot topic today as they were 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, basically, I believe that between, of course, you can go much further back than like 50 years, because if you go with the sociology of disasters in terms of the work of people like Enrico Quarantelli and Russell Dines in past Descansin, and then you can go back to 1918 and the event of the Halifax explosion. I'm going to not deal with those because it was more in the sociology of disaster and response and recovery mainly. But mainly I believe that just about everything that is relevant today was invented 30, 40 years ago. And it has been given increased empirical evidence, or it's been better fabricated as an argument, or it has been added to with other conceptual domains. For instance, I think the movement from vulnerability ideas, which basically come from the 70s and the work of people like Ben and Phil O'Keefe and etc., its transformation into this social construction of risk notion, which is vulnerability based, but much wider, because it even accepts that hazards are socially constructed. There's a physical event, but etc. Exposure is socially constructed. So I believe that, you know, what was developed by people like Ben and everything in the early 70s and Bradford, etc., has been folded in and taken up on and widened to give the fundamental basis of what is the common, most consensual interpretation of risk and disaster today, and which put risk into the center of analysis and not disaster. Disaster is the result of pre-existing risk conditions, which under certain conditions get transformed into loss and damage and impacts, etc. And then automatically the development basis, or the skewed development basis, or the inadequate development basis of this automatically comes into this. So the whole thing of risk drivers, of underlying root causes, etc., is all a derivative of things that were put together at some time in the past, combined with other philosophical stances from Hegel, from Marx, from the classic economists, etc., that come together. And then, you know, looking at it from the perspective of just where I was mainly involved, like Lavell from 1988, 89 onwards, or that was when I came into the topic. But I know we developed the whole idea of small and medium disasters in the early 90s and Desinventar database. And that turned in, because of Andrew's influence, we know that this is follow-on things into extensive and intensive risk, which is a very significant contribution to the understandings today. And so on, with a lot of topics that were brought up in the 80s and 90s are being carried on and made more fulfilled, more fulfilling, more attractive in terms of the type of approach they take. Interdisciplinarity has been discussed for a long time, and you ask yourself how many ideas that lay dormant all of a sudden come floating into the future. So basically, I think everything we did in the past, not us, just as Lavell, but Ian Davis did, that Ben Wisner, of course, did, is highly relevant today. And everything we have today is part of that historical process of fine-tuning knowledge, fine-tuning understanding, fine-tuning concepts, etc. And as I say, you know, my heroes and my gurus have influenced my thought, and I'm sure my thought will influence other people's thought. But in the end, the thought starts somewhere way in the back. For me, Ken Hewitt and these things of everyday risk. You have a whole thing of everyday risk, quotidian risk, the idea of that disasters aren't abnormal events, they have a continuity of today, they reflect today's problems, etc. All of that comes from the past, that's nothing new, but it's put over as almost by a lot of people as if it's new, because precisely they don't know the history of the topic, they haven't read on the topic, they don't have the privilege of being an academic, that's okay. But I think what you're doing, for instance, in this, and showing that this happens. And none of us are the inventor of anything. All we are the accumulator of knowledge which is being built up and giving it a different twist and a turn, etc., and take it forward in that way. So, yeah, I think everything is relevant, but particularly the social construction of risk, the development, skewed development base of most risk, the fact that as Andrew and I wrote in this thing we wrote on the future of disaster risk management, which was published in 2015, between endogenous and exogenous interpretations. All of this done in the past came to the idea that risk is endogenous, it is not exogenous, and therefore it throws it back to society to resolve a problem, not controlling nature, controlling ourselves. The war is against ourselves. With COVID, what have we seen? A war against a virus? No, there's no war against the virus. There's a war against us as society and the way we react to these things, etc. So past is in the present. There's nothing new today that doesn't have a basis in those years between the first half of the last century onwards, 1950 onwards, and particularly 1970 onwards.
And so how do you see the field now? I mean, do you see the changes for good or for bad, or is there a kind of cyclical element, or is it more a linear thing? I think especially Andrew, having been part of the UN and now hearing also the UN mentioning or inventing things that were said 30 odd years ago, seems to indicate that there's not necessarily a lot of increased learning or in the field, and that there's like every new generation is also kind of trying to reinvent things a bit, and then I mean that's one part of the question, and the other question is how does climate change and the whole resilience debate kind of reinforces the insights or kind of maybe undermines some of the insights. And Allan, now what about the academic world? Do you see kind of a progress in their thinking, or is it also kind of reinventing with the new generation coming, or do they build upon your thoughts and others' thoughts?
Yeah, well, basically, what I think is that most things that have to be said and most things that have to be conceptualized are adequately done so from my perspective now. It's not that it's full, it's not complete, it needs questioning and fine-tuning, but basically the social construction interpretation of things, all of the principal notions around skewed development, endogeneity, etc., which is interesting. That really what the United Nations does, and that's as it should do, is to take up on thought that has mainly been generated in academic circles. Sendai is a reflection of the academic debate and well put into place in many things and lacking in other things, etc. And so that's okay. That's okay as long as there's recognition of who participates in developing what. But what has happened is that the topic has become so nicely sophisticated in its understanding and interpretation problem, but it's now got into a cul-de-sac, precisely because of the underlying risks, underlying causes, you back to development models, and therefore throws you back to ideology and to inequality and everything. So now, instead of being something separate from the rest, which was disaster response, it was something extraordinary like a fire, etc. It wasn't part of today's reality. It was something that required organizations to attend to it and then build back from it. Now it's right in the center of humanity and of human development and everything and development. And it can't escape. Like, to talk about disaster risk governance, this is a thing we've been talking about with Andrew a lot, and we've talked about it in the past. There's no such thing as disaster risk governance separate from governance in general. You won't get anything with disaster risk governance that you don't have on a national level, because that's the way society is constructed in terms of its decision-making processes. So now we're in a cul-de-sac because we can't change reality, but reality doesn't seem to want to change the situation of crisis and growing crises and growing risk and growing loss and damage.
Is the resilience discourse that started following Kobe, Is it contributing to this cul-de-sac? Is it kind of undermining the social construction of risk, or is it does it have an added value? Because now, I mean, you can't talk about DRR without at least mentioning resilience once in a while. And I sometimes wonder whether this is a positive development or not.
Well, I'll be very brief, and then maybe Andrew, because I talk a lot about this. People ask me a lot about resilience. I've been actually asked to write prologues to books on resilience, and I always tell them, well, you know, I don't like the term. I don't like the way it's developed. So why are you asking me to write a prologue? Precisely because of that. So I won't go any further, because I think there are virtues, undoubtedly, you know, but those virtues are more on the meta-analysis side of it and bringing people together in a common discourse, etc. But the disadvantages of having so many interpretations of things, and the fact that all it does is to take up on things that were developed conceptually in other frameworks before. There's nothing in it which is new. It's just bringing it together under a term called resilience, which confuses, because some people want to use it as it was used in ecology or child psychology or engineering originally. They want to use it in that way, and others want to use it for disaster risk reduction, you know, as ex ante, whereas it's always was a response to a crisis, you know, and it was not a normative statement. It was something that existed that allowed people to actually reconstitute themselves in different ways. But that's my idea. But at the same time, one has to be broad in one's interpretation of it. It's the same as we're discussing now, systemic risk. You know, this is sort of like, you know, it seems to be something we've talked about a lot in the past, and all of a sudden it comes out under another name, and also is significant, of course, because it's come to a global scale. But at the same time, if we can't trace back, we can't understand where we are now again. And most of these things have origins in the past. I'm not a big, I think the balance would be that resilience, you know, in this book, in the prologue I wrote, I said, the big test is in 30 years, if we imagined that resilience had never been invented as a term, would things be any different in 30 years? Yeah, so so what has it actually added to the transformation we will see in the future? But Andrew, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure whether I'll answer the question, but I'll just add 2 points in a sense to what Allan was saying. I mean, I think one of the problems I can see now is over complexitizing. That's probably not a word, but I mean, making the subject far more complex than it actually really needs to be. Because I mean, like, well, right now, Allan and me, we're living in a village in Costa Rica, yeah, but it could be a village in Peru or a village in India or whatever, or a small town. And actually, most of the problems are extremely simple, yeah. I mean, the governance issues is like, okay, how do you actually persuade, you know, the local government to actually just carry out operations and maintenance on the road network or bridges, yeah? How do you persuade the electricity company to, you know, maintain the power network so we don't get power cuts every half an hour, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And most of these issues, they're not specialized DRR, resilience, systemic risk issues. They're just basically down to simple bread and butter, normal governance issues, which any local government in the world faces, whether it's in Belgium, Costa Rica, Peru, or wherever. So unfortunately, I think there's been, because the subjects become a specialized subject, and that, you know, you can go to university now and study disaster risk management, and probably there'll be master's degrees on systemic risk governance before where we know where we are. It just takes it, it's taking it further and further away from the simplicity of things that just need to be sorted out. You know, if you ask, okay, what needs to happen after the COVID pandemic when it's eventually over? You say, well, yeah, one of the lessons is, you know, governments need to invest more in public health services. Now, that doesn't need a framework for systemic risk governance to come up with that. It's just sort of, it is simple, yeah? So, and I've said to Allan, because I still work a lot for the Peruvian government, yeah? National government. I mean, probably 2 or 3 times a year, I'd spend some time working for them. And what I see is a bit of a trend. I mean, I remember discussing this with Allan a while back. You know, it's like Peru's got really bright people. So a lot of people go to Europe, to Holland, or to Belgium, or to the UK, or to wherever, doing masters and doctorates, come back and then get a job in the government, and then come up with these amazingly complicated planning frameworks and monitoring frameworks and analytical frameworks, which the government think, well, this is coming from, you know, Chicago or Louvain or wherever, and it must be brilliant. And then the government gets itself tied in knots with these overly complicated analytical and planning and monitoring frameworks so much that they can't actually end up doing anything. And most of what Lee's doing, as I said, I insist, is really, really simple. And it's the same simple stuff that was needed to be done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever. So that's, I think, there's an over complexity, over specialization is a huge problem. And the other one is just really lack of imagination. I mean, I think there's so many people, whether it's government functionaries, academics, whoever, I just look at this with a completely mechanical viewpoint, a lack of imagination. It's like when I hear the expression, yeah, I mean, you read about this all the time, you know, there's been like a storm. Like yesterday here was a big rainstorm, yeah? So it's like someone will call me and say, can we attribute this rainstorm to climate change, yeah? I mean, you can't, how can you separate out the storm from the climate and ask, did the climate affect the storm? I mean, this is like, you know, it's like, it's this kind of like mechanical, non-holistic sort of way of thinking, which again, for me, was what Red ultimately was all about, was breaking this down. I mean, just trying to sort of imagine things in a different way, in which things don't mechanically, one thing affects something else. And you can see this mechanical sort of logic of thought in, I would say, in for the 80 or 90% of the academic literature, unfortunately, and in 80 or 90% of government policy. And that's where it doesn't get us anywhere, because it brings us into these stupid cul-de-sac questions of, you know, how much of yesterday's storm can be attributed to climate change.
Just one last thing, Bruno.
Just Allan, maybe on that. I mean, you've been involved in some IPCC reports, and do you feel like climate adaptation is adding to this over complexity, or is it a clear ally of the DRR agenda, or is it somewhere in between?
Well, I believe that a lot of people believe it should be, they should be allies, or they should be linked, or they should be seen as having a common groundwork, and therefore with certain levels of specialization. But we know there are different origins of, yeah, we do this a lot of the time, is we create a problem because of academic malaise or sectorial malaise, and then we spend our time trying to remedy it in the future, and we never get around to remedying it. This one with climate change and DRR it's to me so obvious where the relationships are and what the differences are. It's so obvious that global warming is not climate change, as they sort of like, or sea level rise is not climate change, but they put it in climate change. There's a whole load of misconceptions about things as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm not sure where you go with this now, because the problem has been created. And that is an interesting thing, I think, because most of disaster work and now climate change is resolving a problem that has been created because of misconceptions from the beginning. That may sound very arrogant to say, but I say it with having looked at things. For instance, going back to what we were talking about before with disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management, emphasis on risk, great. Risk, if it didn't exist, could not be transformed into disaster. So we come to this corrective and prospective division that we generated, where corrective is, it's on the ground, it's there, the disaster's a problem. It's going to be a problem because you're just waiting for an event. And a lot of the ideas around how you do this, and there is an area of specialization called disaster risk reduction, because you've now got the problem. You have to retrofit your hospital, you have to move people, you have to put dikes by the side of rivers. But prospective risk management, which we call disaster risk management, isn't disaster risk management. It is a call to society to have adequate professional practice and adequate governance arrangements. So if we could get land use planning to work, we wouldn't have a risk. If we could get people to build well, we wouldn't have a risk. And so that's not a disaster problem. That's a problem of society living in an environment which is changing and that it has to adapt to, and has always adapted to historically if it wanted to be successful. Where it didn't, it got wiped off the planet, right? Those that didn't, but over-farmed its land, that over-farmed its forest, disappeared, simply. They just, and so when we put it into that sort of phase, the whole problem of what we're dealing with is very difficult, because we need all those other people that have never ever thought about disasters being part of their domain, you know, because they've been in development things. But what have I got to do with disaster? You know, disaster is when something happens that is etc. And so, yeah, I think we're surrounded by a whole series of mislaid steps in the development of things, or the inability to take steps back from where we've come to and say what we need is a whole new thought process. We need a whole new educational process around this. And that's with climate change, or with, to me, for instance, and I'll finish there, but to me, adaptation to me should never be talking about extreme events, or you don't adapt to extreme events, no. Extreme events, the whole terminology has thrown us back centuries almost, because we worked for 40 years to show it was a problem of vulnerability and exposure, not of the size or intensity of the events. And all of a sudden we're now faced with, and most of these events aren't even extreme, what they're talking about. They're sort of way down the scale of extremity, you know? So the whole climate change thing is built into us another thought process, which is actually going against what we've been trying to do in disaster risk management for years. I don't say everybody and everything, but let's keep adaptation to things to do with slowly changing climate, slowly changing averages, slowly changing, etc. Not to what we deal with in disaster risk management, which in the end are not abnormal events.
Okay, maybe as a last question, and I think you mentioned already some of the people who were your main influencers and your gurus. I mean, you mentioned Kenneth Hewitt. Are there other people? I mean, probably also some of the social scientists in the US, but are there other people whose shoulders you were standing, as Ian Davies was mentioning in his publication, that kind of influenced you? And definitely you're an influencer yourself now for the following generations, but people you would say that have really shaped your thinking. I mean, both of you. Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the disaster side, Ian, yeah, and I mean, Fred Cooney from those very early times. I remember talking to him a lot. Ken, I never met. I mean, unlike Allan, I never met Ken, but I remember reading his book. What's it called?
Interpretations of Calamity. Or, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But so that was, I mean, not all of the book. There were a couple of chapters in there, which when I remember when I was writing the Oxfam book, kind of really resonated with me quite strongly. But then most of the people who influenced me are really outside of the disaster world. So I mean, like the whole group of urban geographers and sociologists like Manuel Castells, David Harvey, and so on have been enormously influential in my work. In the housing side, the person I mentioned earlier on, John F.C. Turner, the architect, was incredibly influential. Adrian Sherwood as a dub producer was incredibly influential. So I've got like influences from different places, or from, I can think of movie directors that have probably influenced me more than like disaster theorists. And I think Allan probably agree with me. I mean, the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to DRR is becoming a sort of a specialist area. So when you see people actually doing bachelor's and bachelor's degrees, particularly in DRR, I think, my God, there's something wrong. Because if everything Allan's just said is correct, yeah, that this is actually about doing development properly, who we need to be learning from, people who are managing urban development, infrastructure, forestry, waters, oceans, human society. So in a sense, the more I hear people saying, well, I was really influenced by, even by us, I mean, vis-a-vis disaster people, I'd much prefer people to be influenced by kind of brilliant people from the sort of the core disciplines which are around development.
What Andrew says is also true. There's a whole group, there are a group of people that you identify with that topic, to put it that way. Even from people like Russ Dines, who I learned a lot about organizational theory, but also I learned a lot, and I think this is significant with Ian Davis, and I actually wrote in this small piece for the book. But I didn't really read very much of Ian because I wasn't in that particular aspect. I read Shelter After Disaster and a couple of other things, and documents he's written more recently on the history of a topic and how he feels the topic has gone. But what I learned from people like Ian was humility, sense of humor, critical thought, and an excellent rapport with people, which is so fundamental. Be able to talk to people, to convince them, to engage them in the topic and transform them into something that you would like to see in people. You know, as in my mindset, obviously, Ken Hewitt was very significant. Ben Wisner has been very significant. Phil O'Keefe in the early sort of writings, etc. And maybe a series, and in Latin America, Gustavo Wilches, and Andrew has influenced me a great deal, obviously. You know, as you know, we've had a synergistic relationship as we've gone along, where we don't do exactly the same, but we're more or less compatible in the areas we're going through. But then, as he said, I came out of urban and regional development and out of inequality theory, and so people like Amirta Sen have had great influence in the thought of one, but equally, you know, Jose Luis Corraggio, who was one of the great theorists of spatial theory in Latin America, but I worked with a lot in El Colegio de Mexico and in Latin America. Fernando Carrion, a great urban specialist in Ecuador, and many others that I don't want to mention because I'll forget the ones that have an influence. But it's on the overall thought process, not on the particular topic, that I feel the influence has become. And that's why Ken was so significant, because he's talking philosophy, he's talking about ways of conceiving reality, ideas, etc., and a whole group of people that surrounded him. Ken Mitchell, I loved Ken Mitchell's writing, James Mitchell from Rutgers. But others like, you know, I've learned from Mark Pelling, I've learned from a lot of people, you as you read through them.
I'd like to thank you very much for the interview. It's been very interesting and very informative.